90 seconds. Lieutenant Ethan Walker said into his headset, his voice steady despite the pressure building around him. That's all it takes for a mission to go from routine to history. The valley seemed frozen beneath the pale afternoon sun. Jagged ridgelines stretched across the horizon, casting long shadows over the narrow pass where the SEAL team had stopped to reassess their route. A dry wind swept through the rocks, carrying dust across the ground in thin waves. Nothing moved. Nothing looked unusual. That was what bothered Ethan most. 10 minutes earlier, everything had appeared normal. The team had advanced through the mountain corridor exactly as planned, following intelligence that suggested the area had been abandoned days before. Now, every instinct he had developed through years of deployments told him something was wrong. The silence felt too complete. Even the wind seemed careful. Ethan crouched behind a weathered outcrop and scanned the slopes above. Layers of stone rose hundreds of feet overhead, creating countless places where a single observer could watch the valley floor without ever being seen. Around him, the members of his team remained calm, disciplined, and alert. No one panicked. No one wasted energy. Yet everyone sensed the same thing. They were being watched. A voice crackled through the radio. Movement on the eastern ridge. Heads turned instantly. Ethan lifted his binoculars. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a silhouette disappear behind a cluster of rocks nearly 600 yards away. Then it was gone. Another report came in from the opposite side. Then another. Tiny signs. Small glimpses. Never enough to confirm. Just enough to create doubt. The valley suddenly felt much smaller than it had 5 minutes earlier. Ethan checked the terrain map attached to his vest. The route ahead narrowed even further before opening into a wider basin. Behind them, steep slopes limited visibility. To either side, towering cliffs dominated the landscape. It was a perfect place to observe movement. A perfect place to wait. The realization settled over the team gradually, like a storm cloud moving across sunlight. They had entered a position that offered very few advantages and countless unknowns. One of the operators lowered his scope and looked toward Ethan. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think we're completely surrounded." No one laughed. No one argued. Ethan studied the ridgelines again. The words felt uncomfortably accurate. The mountains seemed alive now. Every shadow looked deeper. Every rock formation looked deliberate. He could feel eyes on them from places he could not identify. The wind picked up again, whistling through narrow cracks in the stone. Dust drifted across the valley floor. Somewhere high above, beyond the reach of their vision, an unseen figure lay motionless against the mountainside. Patient, silent, watching the same ridgelines Ethan was studying, watching the same shadows, waiting for the exact moment when everything would change. And as the final 90 seconds of certainty slipped away, none of the men below had any idea that their greatest ally was already there. Ethan Walker lowered the binoculars and exhaled slowly. The valley remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt natural. It felt organized, intentional, the kind of silence that existed when unseen people were waiting for something. The sun hung low enough to paint the western cliffs in gold, while the eastern slopes remained buried in shadow. Every minute that passed seemed to sharpen the contrast. Light and darkness divided the mountains into separate worlds. The team gathered near a cluster of weathered boulders that offered the best cover available. It was not much. The terrain had looked manageable from satellite imagery. Standing inside it was a different experience entirely. Distances felt deceptive. Angles hid more than they revealed. Ethan studied the ridgelines again, tracing potential observation points with his eyes. Nothing moved. Nothing confirmed the feeling growing in his chest. Yet years of experience had taught him that certainty was not always necessary. Sometimes survival depended on listening to instincts before evidence arrived. "Options?" he asked. Senior Chief Ryan Mercer unfolded a laminated map. Dust coated the corners. North route is exposed for almost half a mile. South route runs through the narrow cut. If somebody is watching, they already know exactly where we would go. Ethan nodded. Neither choice sounded promising. The radio hissed softly. Their support aircraft had been redirected by deteriorating weather conditions nearly 50 miles away. Reinforcements would take time. More time than Ethan wanted to hear. Above them, clouds drifted across the sky in slow motion. Thin and scattered. Not enough to block visibility. Just enough to cast shifting shadows across the mountains. One operator adjusted his position and scanned the upper slopes through a spotting scope. "Still seeing occasional movement," he said. "Nothing I can identify." Ethan followed his gaze. For an instant, he thought he saw a reflection flash from a distant ridge nearly 900 yards away. A tiny glimmer. Then it vanished. The moment passed so quickly he wondered if he had imagined it. Around them, the valley seemed to hold its breath. The wind faded. The air felt strangely heavy. Even the usual sounds of the mountains had disappeared. No birds. No distant engines. Nothing except the occasional crackle of radio traffic. Ryan looked toward the western ridge. "Whoever is up there knows this terrain better than we do." Ethan agreed. The realization settled over him with uncomfortable clarity. They had entered someone else's chessboard. Every path, every rock formation, every blind corner favored the unseen observers. The team remained disciplined, calm, professional. Yet Ethan could see the tension building behind their eyes. Not fear, anticipation. The awareness that events were already moving beyond their control. High above the valley floor, more than 1,000 feet up the mountainside, a lone figure remained perfectly still among fractured stone and scattered patches of dry grass. Through a scope pointed toward the ridgelines, she observed the same terrain Ethan was studying. Claire Bennett adjusted her breathing and watched a distant silhouette emerge briefly from behind a rock formation before disappearing again. She did not speak. She did not move. A notebook beside her contained only a few coordinates and a simple timeline. The final entry was less than 10 minutes away. Far below, Ethan checked his watch. The seconds continued to slip away. He still did not know Claire existed. He still did not know someone was already working to keep his team alive. But somewhere between the shifting shadows and the silent ridges, the first pieces of a much larger picture were beginning to reveal themselves. Claire Bennett had learned long ago that patience was often more valuable than speed. The mountains taught that lesson better than any instructor ever could. She lay motionless against a shelf of stone, nearly 1,000 feet above the valley floor, her uniform blending into the muted colors of dust, rock, and sunlight. A casual observer could have looked directly at her position and seen nothing unusual. That was exactly the point. The afternoon wind brushed across the ridge, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant rain. Claire adjusted a dial on her scope by a fraction of an inch and continued watching the terrain below. Through magnified glass, the valley unfolded like a map. Every ridgeline, every shadow, every narrow path between the rocks. She had arrived before sunrise and spent hours studying the landscape. Patterns emerged when people remained still long enough. Tiny movements revealed larger intentions. A shifting shadow, a brief reflection, a figure appearing where no figure should be. Most people never noticed those details. Claire always did. Her radio remained silent beside her. She preferred it that way. Silence allowed her to think. Silence allowed her to listen. Somewhere below, Lieutenant Ethan Walker and his team were trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Claire could see them gathering near the boulders. Small figures from her position. Calm despite the circumstances. Disciplined despite the uncertainty. She respected that. Many people became careless when pressure arrived. The team below had not. A gust of wind swept across the mountain. Dust drifted through the air in thin ribbons. Claire blinked once and returned her attention to the eastern ridge. There, another movement. Less than a second. Easy to miss. Her eyes narrowed. The shape disappeared again behind stone. She made a note in her notebook. No dramatic language. No speculation. Just coordinates and observations. Facts mattered more than assumptions. The sun continued its slow descent toward the western horizon. Light shifted across the valley floor. Shadows stretched longer. Visibility changed minute by minute. Claire understood that timing would soon become critical. Certain positions that were visible now would disappear entirely within the next hour. Others would become exposed. The mountains constantly rearranged the battlefield without moving an inch. She checked her watch. 7 minutes. That was all. 7 minutes until the situation below changed permanently one way or another. Claire reached into a side pocket and removed a folded photograph. The edges were worn from years of travel. It showed her father standing beside a weathered pickup truck outside a ranch in Montana. He had taught her many things when she was young. Most of them simple. Do not waste words. Pay attention. Help people when you can. She looked at the photograph for only a moment before sliding it back into her pocket. The lessons remained. That was enough. Far below, Ethan Walker stepped away from his team and studied the ridgeline directly beneath Claire's position. For a brief second, she wondered if he had somehow spotted her. Then his gaze shifted elsewhere. He was searching for answers he could not yet see. Claire returned to her scope. Another flash appeared near the eastern ridge. Then another. Tiny signals. Tiny mistakes. The larger picture was finally becoming clear. She slowed her breathing and settled deeper against the stone. The waiting was almost over. The first sign was not a sound. It was an absence. Ethan Walker noticed it immediately. The occasional flashes that had appeared along the ridgelines simply stopped. Every suspicious movement vanished at once. The mountains became still again. Too still. He lowered his binoculars and exchanged a glance with Ryan Mercer. Neither man liked what they were seeing. When uncertainty suddenly disappears, it usually means someone has made a decision. The wind drifted through the valley, carrying loose dust across the rocks. Above them, sunlight slipped lower across the western cliffs, painting the stone in deep shades of amber and gold. Shadows lengthened by the minute. Ethan checked his watch. Something was about to happen. He could feel it. Around the team, equipment remained packed and ready. Every operator maintained discipline. Nobody rushed. Nobody spoke unnecessarily. Yet an invisible pressure had settled over the valley floor. The kind that made time feel slower than normal. High above, Claire Bennett remained focused on the eastern ridge. Through her scope, a pattern that had taken hours to reveal itself finally became impossible to ignore. The scattered observations, the brief movements, the disappearing silhouettes. They all pointed toward the same conclusion. She adjusted her position slightly against the stone. Not because she was uncomfortable, because the angle of the sun had changed. Details mattered. Tiny adjustments mattered. Everything mattered now. Her eyes followed a narrow section of ridge nearly 800 yards from Ethan's position. There, for less than a second, a figure appeared. Then another. Then both vanished behind rock. Claire did not react emotionally. She never did. Excitement clouded judgment. Fear clouded judgment. Patience did not. She watched. Calculated. Confirmed. The mountain breeze brushed against her face. Her breathing remained slow and steady. Below, Ethan continued studying the terrain. Then he saw it. A brief reflection. Sharp and bright. Gone before he could focus on it. "Did you catch that?" he asked quietly. Ryan nodded. "I saw it." Neither man knew exactly what it meant. They only knew it was there. For several long seconds, nothing else happened. The valley returned to silence. Then a small pebble rolled down a distant slope. Ethan turned toward the sound instinctively. One pebble. Nothing more. Yet the movement confirmed what his instincts had been warning him about all afternoon. Someone was there. Watching. Waiting. The realization settled over the team like a cold weight. High above, Claire's notebook remained open beside her elbow. She glanced at the final coordinate she had written less than 10 minutes earlier. Every observation pointed to the same area. Every clue connected. The puzzle was complete. She slowly lifted her radio and pressed the transmit button for the first time that day. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. "This is Bennett," she said. "I have visual confirmation." The response came immediately through static. "Copy." Claire released the button. That was all the conversation required. No speeches. No explanations. Facts were enough. Below, Ethan had no idea that message had just been sent. He only knew that the valley suddenly felt different. The air seemed tighter. The shadows seemed deeper. Somewhere above him, unseen and unnoticed, a woman on a mountainside had just reached the same conclusion he was struggling to find. The difference was that Claire Bennett already knew exactly where to look. The radio on Ethan Walker's vest crackled softly, then fell silent again. No new instructions arrived. No new information. The uncertainty remained. Yet something had changed. He could feel it. The pressure that had been building all afternoon no longer felt random. It felt focused, as if an invisible hand had finally touched the board and moved a piece. Ethan rose slightly behind the rocks and studied the eastern ridge once more. The same shadows remained. The same stone formation stood against the fading sky. But now he noticed something different. The small flashes that had appeared throughout the afternoon were gone entirely. Whoever had been moving up there had stopped. The valley seemed to be waiting. Ryan Mercer checked the horizon through his scope. "Everything just froze," he said quietly. Ethan nodded. I noticed. Neither man understood why. High above them, Claire Bennett remained motionless against the mountainside. Her world had narrowed to measurements, distances, wind patterns, and observation. She watched the ridge through her scope with complete concentration. The figure she had identified earlier appeared once more for a brief moment before disappearing behind stone. Then another appeared farther north. Then another. Not random. Not isolated. Connected. Claire followed each movement carefully. The pieces aligned exactly as she suspected. The notebook beside her remained open to a page filled with coordinates and small observations written in neat handwriting. No dramatic notes. No speculation. Only facts. Facts were reliable. Facts saved lives. The afternoon sun slipped lower, casting long shadows across the mountain face. Temperatures began to fall. The heat that had dominated the valley hours earlier slowly released its grip. A cool breeze moved through the rocks. Claire adjusted her position slightly and studied a narrow passage between two ridgelines. The terrain created a natural funnel. Anyone moving through the valley would eventually be drawn toward it. She understood the advantage immediately. She also understood the danger. Her radio came alive again. Bennett, go ahead. Any updates? Claire continued watching the ridge. Pattern confirmed, she replied. Recommend they hold position. A short pause followed. Copy. The transmission ended. Below, Ethan remained unaware of the conversation taking place above him. He only knew his instincts were telling him not to move. Every possible route seemed wrong. Every direction seemed to create more questions than answers. The mountains had become a maze of uncertainty. Then something unusual happened. A cloud drifted across the sun. For a few seconds, the valley darkened. The shadows blended together. Colors disappeared. Details vanished. When the sunlight returned moments later, Claire immediately spotted what the changing light had revealed. A shape that had been hidden before now stood out clearly against the rock. Then another, and another. Not enough to create panic. More than enough to confirm her assessment. Claire lowered her scope and looked toward the valley floor where Ethan and his team waited among the rocks. From her position, they appeared small against the vast landscape. Vulnerable. Unaware of how close they were to a situation they could not fully see. She lifted the scope again and allowed herself the faintest hint of satisfaction. Not because the situation was improving. Because uncertainty was disappearing. The mystery that had dominated the afternoon was finally becoming clear. And when clarity arrived, Claire Bennett knew exactly what to do next. The mountains grew quieter as evening approached. The sunlight that had dominated the valley all day began retreating from the ridgelines, leaving pockets of shadow across the stone. Ethan Walker watched the terrain carefully, searching for answers that continued to remain just out of reach. The feeling of being observed had not disappeared. If anything, it had become stronger. Around him, the team remained steady. Water bottles were checked. Equipment was adjusted. Radio stayed low. Nobody wasted movement. The discipline of experience settled over the group like a second uniform. Yet beneath that calm surface, everyone understood they were standing in the middle of a situation that was becoming more complicated by the minute. High above them, Claire Bennett finally allowed herself a brief moment away from the scope. She rolled one shoulder to ease the stiffness that came from remaining still for hours. The motion lasted only seconds. Then she returned to work. Her attention shifted to the notebook beside her. The page contained only facts, coordinates, distances, observations. Looking at it now reminded her of another notebook from years earlier. Different mountains, different mission, different version of herself. Claire had not planned to spend her life in remote places studying ridgelines and reading terrain. Growing up outside Bozeman, Montana, she imagined something quieter. Her father managed cattle on a ranch that stretched for miles beneath open skies. Summers were spent repairing fences, riding horses, and learning lessons that rarely appeared in books. The most important lesson came from watching him solve problems. He never rushed, never reacted emotionally, never confused noise with importance. When neighbors panicked during storms or droughts, he simply gathered information and made decisions one step at a time. Claire carried that habit into adulthood. Years later, instructors noticed the same quality during training. Others focused on speed. Claire focused on observation. Others wanted immediate answers. Claire preferred understanding the entire picture before acting. It made her different. Sometimes it made her unpopular. It also made her reliable. A gust of wind brushed across the ridge and brought her back to the present. She looked through the scope once more. The valley below remained unchanged. Ethan and his team waited among the rocks. The ridgelines remained silent. The shadows continued to grow. Yet Claire no longer saw uncertainty. She saw patterns. She saw intentions. Most importantly, she saw timing. Everything happening in the valley depended on timing. The people moving along the distant ridges depended on it. The team below depended on it. Even the mountains seemed to depend on it. Her radio remained quiet. She appreciated that. Too many conversations complicated simple situations. The information she needed was already in front of her. She checked her watch. Less than 30 minutes until sunset. The changing light would alter everything. Distances would become harder to judge. Shadows would merge together. Observation would become more difficult for everyone. Everyone except someone who had prepared for it. Claire adjusted a small setting on her equipment and studied the eastern ridge again. A faint movement appeared near a rock formation she had been monitoring all afternoon. Then another. The pattern continued exactly as expected. She nodded once to herself. Far below, Ethan Walker stared toward the same ridge without realizing that the woman watching from above already knew more about the situation than anyone else in the valley. The final pieces were falling into place. And for the first time that day, Claire Bennett felt completely certain about what was coming next. The first sound arrived as a distant vibration carried across the evening air. Ethan Walker lifted his head immediately. It was faint, easy to miss. A low mechanical hum somewhere beyond the western ridges. The team heard it too. Several operators exchanged quick glances, but said nothing. The sound disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Then silence returned. Ethan checked the horizon. The fading sunlight had transformed the valley. Colors softened. Shadows stretched across the ground like dark rivers flowing between the rocks. Visibility changed with every passing minute. The landscape that had seemed familiar an hour earlier now felt entirely different. Beside him, Ryan Mercer adjusted his scope. "Did you hear that?" Ethan nodded. "I did." Neither man could identify the source. Yet both understood that time was becoming the most important factor in the valley. Every minute gained mattered. Every minute lost mattered even more. High above, Claire Bennett remained focused on the ridgelines. Through her scope, she observed subtle changes unfolding across the terrain. The movements she had tracked all afternoon were becoming less confident, less organized. The predictable pattern she had documented earlier was beginning to shift. That alone told her something important. Somewhere in the valley, people were realizing that their assumptions had been wrong. Claire adjusted her position slightly and studied a cluster of rocks near the eastern ridge. The same location, the same observation point, the same pattern, except now the rhythm had changed. She opened her notebook and added a single line beneath her previous notes. Then she closed it. No further explanation was necessary. The information spoke for itself. A cool breeze swept across the mountainside. The temperature dropped noticeably. Claire welcomed it. Cooler air improved visibility. It sharpened details. Tiny movements became easier to detect. Tiny mistakes became harder to hide. Her radio crackled softly. "Status?" a voice asked. Claire continued scanning the terrain. "Holding," she replied. "Recommend patience." The response came after a short pause. "Copy." The channel went silent again. Far below, Ethan remained unaware of the conversation taking place overhead. Yet he sensed something changing. The feeling was difficult to explain. The pressure surrounding the team no longer seemed to be increasing. It felt stalled, delayed, as though an invisible clock had been interrupted. Ethan looked toward the western horizon where the last sunlight touched the peaks. The distant hum returned for a few seconds before fading again. This time he recognized it immediately. Aircraft. Far away. Still beyond visual range. But moving closer. Ryan heard it too. "That sounds promising," he said. Ethan allowed himself the smallest smile of the day. Maybe. High on the mountain, Claire watched the valley through steady eyes. The timing she had anticipated was unfolding almost exactly as expected. The uncertainty that had trapped Ethan's team throughout the afternoon was beginning to fracture. Not disappear. Not yet. But crack. Small openings were appearing where none had existed before. Opportunities. Possibilities. Time. Most people underestimated the value of time. Claire never did. Sometimes the difference between success and failure was not strength, speed, or luck. Sometimes it was simply giving the right people enough time to find their way forward. As darkness slowly approached the valley, Claire Bennett knew that was exactly what she had accomplished. The sound returned just after sunset. This time it was unmistakable. Aircraft. Distant but approaching. Ethan Walker stood beside the weathered rocks and listened carefully as the low hum rolled across the valley. No one celebrated. No one relaxed. Experience had taught them that hearing help and seeing help were two very different things. The mountains still controlled the situation. The mountains always had. The last traces of sunlight faded from the western peaks, leaving the valley wrapped in deep blue shadows. Visibility dropped rapidly. Details that had been clear minutes earlier dissolved into darkness. Ethan raised his binoculars one more time and scanned the ridgelines. The uncertainty that had haunted the entire afternoon remained. Yet something else had appeared alongside it. Opportunity. For the first time all day, the valley no longer felt completely closed. High above, Claire Bennett watched the same landscape transform beneath the approaching night. The fading light created challenges for everyone. Distances became harder to judge. Shapes blended together. Familiar terrain became unfamiliar. But Claire had prepared for that long before arriving. She adjusted her equipment and continued observing the ridges. The patterns she had followed for hours were finally breaking apart. Movements that once appeared coordinated now seemed uncertain. Predictable rhythms had vanished. The careful structure she had identified earlier was no longer holding together. Her assessment had been correct. Time had changed everything. She checked her watch. The aircraft would arrive soon. Not immediately. Soon. The distinction mattered. Beside her, the mountain remained silent except for the occasional whisper of wind moving through the rocks. Claire looked toward the valley floor where Ethan and his team waited. Tiny figures against an enormous landscape. She wondered briefly what they thought was happening. Whether they realized how many small decisions had quietly shaped the outcome of their day. Probably not. Most people never saw the invisible work behind visible results. That was fine with her. Her radio crackled. "Bennett, go ahead. Command wants confirmation." Claire returned her attention to the ridgeline. A long moment passed. Then she answered. "Situation stabilized. Recommend extraction window now." Silence followed. Then a single response. "Copy." The transmission ended. No congratulations. No dramatic speeches. Just information moving from one person to another. Exactly the way she preferred it. Far below, Ethan heard the aircraft again. Louder now. Close enough to identify direction. Several members of the team looked toward the western horizon where distant navigation lights briefly appeared between layers of darkness and mountain silhouettes. The sight lasted only seconds before disappearing behind a ridge. Yet it was enough. Ryan Mercer released a breath he seemed to have been holding all afternoon. "Looks like somebody finally found us." Ethan smiled faintly. "Looks that way." The valley felt different now. Not safe. Not easy. Different. The weight pressing against the team throughout the day had begun to lift. Questions remained unanswered. Mysteries remained unsolved. But the outcome no longer felt uncertain. High on the mountainside, Claire Bennett closed her notebook. Hours of observations. Pages of coordinates. A full day reduced to simple facts written in black ink. She slipped it into her pack and looked across the darkening valley one final time. The mission was ending. Her work was finished. Below, the team she had spent the entire day protecting still had no idea who she was. Claire did not mind. She had never needed recognition to measure success. Sometimes the best outcome was simply watching people walk away safely without ever knowing your name. The helicopters arrived as dark silhouettes against a sky filled with stars. Their lights moved across the horizon before disappearing behind the ridges and reappearing again closer than before. Ethan Walker watched them descend toward the extraction zone with the same calm focus he had carried throughout the day. Around him, the team gathered equipment and prepared to move. Nobody spoke much. Long missions rarely ended with celebration. They ended with quiet efficiency. The valley that had felt so threatening hours earlier now seemed strangely peaceful beneath the night sky. The wind moved gently through the rocks. Temperatures continued to fall. Somewhere far above, unseen by everyone below, Claire Bennett began packing her gear. The process was methodical. Scope secured. Notebook stored. Equipment checked twice. Nothing rushed. Nothing forgotten. She had spent nearly 12 hours on the mountainside, and now the ridge felt almost familiar. The stone beneath her elbows, the distant peaks along the horizon, the endless silence between radio transmissions. She took one final look toward the valley floor. The aircraft were now visible from her position, their navigation lights drifting slowly through the darkness. The extraction was underway, exactly as planned. Claire allowed herself a small smile before standing for the first time in hours. Her legs protested briefly, then the feeling passed. She slung her pack over one shoulder and began walking along a narrow trail that followed the ridgeline. No audience watched her leave. No cameras recorded the moment. The mountains simply swallowed her silhouette into the darkness. Down below, Ethan climbed aboard the aircraft and secured his harness. The engines filled the air with a steady vibration. As the helicopter lifted from the valley floor, he looked through the open side toward the ridges one last time. Something about the day still bothered him. Not the uncertainty, not the danger, the missing piece. The feeling that someone had been present throughout the entire mission without ever stepping into view. He looked toward the highest ridge and noticed a faint movement near the skyline. A figure, just for a second. Then it disappeared behind the rocks. Ethan stared at the spot. "What is it?" Ryan Mercer asked. Ethan remained silent for a moment. Then he smiled. "Nothing," he said. "Just somebody doing their job." The helicopter turned west and disappeared into the night. Miles away, Claire continued walking beneath a sky crowded with stars. The air smelled of stone and sagebrush. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction. She preferred it that way. Solitude never bothered her. In fact, she trusted it. Her radio crackled one final time. "Good work today, Bennett." Claire looked toward the distant horizon. "Thank you. Anything else to report?" She considered the question for a moment. Then she thought about the valley, the waiting, the uncertainty, the people who would return home because the right decisions had been made at the right time. "No," she answered. "Nothing else." The radio fell silent. Claire continued walking beneath the stars. Tomorrow another mission would arrive. Another valley, another mountain, another group of people who might never know her name. That was fine. Some people wanted recognition. Some wanted medals. Some wanted stories written about them. Claire Bennett wanted none of those things. She simply believed that when the moment arrived, you showed up, stayed calm, and did what needed to be done. The mountains behind her faded into darkness. The valley disappeared from sight. But for the men who left it that night, one truth remained. The quiet ones were never truly ordinary.